Hi all, we're back again on top of Baden Hill, and we're beginning a new unit. This unit we're going to call Trenches. And trenches probably right away makes some of you think of warfare, and specifically World War I. Indeed, this is the lead up, the build up to World War I, and it would be called the war to end all war, and it did exactly the opposite, really. It led to more war, and it has not ended war to this day. So we need to begin by going back in time a little bit. We have been gradually moving forward in time. We've been talking about how countries evolve and how there sometimes are revolutions. But for this discussion of trenches and how they are dug and how they separate countries from one another, we have to go back to the beginning of the 1800s, the beginning of the 19th century. And we're also going to mention what happened just before the 1800s, which was the French Revolution. Now, I've discussed the French Revolution before. You learned about it in a previous course, and so I'm not going to get into all the details, but you need to know that the French Revolution really blew everything wide open, not just in Europe, but really around the world. Revolution was the word of the day. And many of the nations in South America gained their independence during this period of revolution. There is one face that we can put on the revolution, and that is the face of Napoleon. Napoleon was a dictator. He was an egomaniac. There's no question. But he was also the champion of the people. And because of that, they loved him. Probably they feared him too, but it was their love for him that is a remarkable part of the story of how Europe developed through the 1800s all the way toward World War I. Let's go back and talk about one history-changing event, and the event actually lasted nearly a year, but this one event was called the Congress of Vienna. And the Congress of Vienna was an attempt to restore order after the revolutions that Napoleon created. By 1814, it was clear that Napoleon's revolutionary wars were starting to wind down. The tide had turned. Napoleon tried to attack Russia, and he failed miserably because it was a battle against Russian geography. Later, Hitler would make the same mistake. Well, Napoleon was on his heels, and eventually in May of 1814, Napoleon would give up. He would abdicate, and he would be sent into exile. He was sent to an island. Now you might ask, why didn't they execute him? Well, we've already discussed this. We talked about why governments might send an enemy far away into isolation rather than executing that person. Basically, if a hero is executed, that hero becomes a martyr. A martyr is someone who is holy and makes people even more excited, and maybe another person will step in to lead the same revolution in that person's name. So it can be very dangerous to execute a hero. And Napoleon was a hero. He had promised the people freedom and a say in their government in a way that they hadn't had before. And he promised to make sure that the rich people, the nobles and the kings from before, that they weren't allowed to return to power. Well, Napoleon lost. And in 1814, he was sent to the tiny island of Elba, which is not far from the island he was born on, Corsica. And it's not far also from the Italian coast. In addition, through what was called the Treaty of Paris, Napoleon was actually allowed to have control of that island, Elba. And one way you can remember it is Elba is kind of at the elbow of Italy. It's just off the coast of Italy where there's a little bit of a bend. So maybe you can think of it that way. And Napoleon was allowed to rule that island, and he was allowed to keep the title of emperor. Now, it's kind of funny if you think of the fact that he wanted to be emperor of all of Europe, and he ended up emperor in this tiny island of Elba. But it's significant that there was an effort to restore peace and let him rule his fairy tale empire on his fairy tale island. Well, that wasn't going to last, and we'll talk about that in a second. In Europe, because of the revolutions, and you can even think about it as starting with the Enlightenment and the American Revolution, and the fact that people like Thomas Jefferson were writing to leaders all over the world, promoting democracy, promoting freedom, promoting the rights of human beings. And there were others, Voltaire in France, even people like Catherine the Great in Russia and Friedrich the Great in Germany or Prussia. They were all believing that they could make a better world. Now, Catherine the Great and Friedrich the Great, they didn't want to give up power. They wanted to be a benevolent dictator, a benevolent ruler of their country. Benevolent, we've talked about this with God, that God is benevolent. He is good. He wants good things for all of us, but he is a ruler. And so those, Catherine the Great in Russia and Friedrich the Great in Prussia, they wanted to be like God in a way that was reflecting their honoring God and wanting to create kind of heaven on earth. So what was happening, we will call liberal thinking. Liberal means an opening up of liberty. And so people who are liberal traditionally want more freedoms. They want liberty. They want rights for everyday human beings. Conservative forces, conservative people, want things to remain as they have been. Basically, liberal thinking leads to a change, the changing of rulers, the changing of laws. And conservative thinking leads to a preservation of law and order, a preservation of traditions and the way things have been. Many times, Christian leaders were seen as being very conservative. You can imagine why. The church had a lot of power, and so they supported conservative leadership because they thought that that was what God wanted, law and order. So conservative versus liberal is something that's really started at this time, and it has continued to the present day. It has different meanings. A lot of times it has to do with economics, but we'll just leave it at that. On the side of the conservatives were those who supported a monarchy, kings and queens all over Europe, and the rest of the world too, but mainly in Europe. And remember, Napoleon was representing a revolution that had executed the king and queen, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France. They were executed. They were in the guillotine. And so Napoleon was supposed to represent a liberal leader who would give rights to the people, but what he ended up doing was crowning himself emperor. So he was a king. And still people loved him. Go figure. Well, Napoleon then, he had risen to power. He declared war on the United Kingdom, on England. He declared war on Russia and Prussia and all of his enemies. And it looked like for a while he could actually take over all of Europe. But remember, he invaded Russia, and that ended up costing him the crown, and he was sent into exile. Now, France then was basically defeated, and they negotiated a peace treaty. And it looked like that was the beginning of a new Europe, where there could be law and order again, where Napoleon was gone to a faraway island, and things could get back to normal. That leads us to the gathering of diplomats that represented the main powers in Europe. There were 5 main powers, and we have an acronym that can represent them. That acronym, we'll say, is prefab. Prefab. And the E is a little bit of a stretch, but go with me on this. Prefab. So you have Prussia. I'll explain more about Prussia. It is not the same as Russia. Prussia, Russia, and remember these are the European powers, so that's where the E comes from. You have France, you have Austria, and you have Britain. Those were the powers, the players on the battlefield of European politics at the beginning of the 1800s. And now we find ourselves in 1815, the spring of 1815, March 20th, 1815 to be exact. That was when Napoleon returned. I want to say just a little bit more about the Congress of Vienna. It was hosted in Austria, in Vienna, of course, and the diplomat who was in charge, who was the chair of the conference, his name was Clemens von Metternich. Metternich is how I'll refer to him, and most of these leaders, I'll just give you the last name because they have lots of first names or given names or titles. So this Congress assembled in order to restore order, and it was a very conservative conference. Remember, Napoleon represented the liberal forces, and even though there were liberals all over Europe, they were now on the run and they were in hiding because the conservative powers, the monarchs, were coming back to claim their thrones and their power. So Metternich was the chair, and we also need to remember that the man, the general, who defeated Napoleon was Wellington, the Duke of Wellington from Britain. And he gets the credit, even though the Prussians also had a lot to do with defeating Napoleon. That happened at the Battle of Waterloo. So remember 2 W's, Wellington and Waterloo. But wait a minute, I thought Napoleon was on that tiny island of Elba. When he was exiled to Elba, he was separated from his wife and his son. He was pretty much devastated and was desperate. And we probably can try and understand that. He actually started to turn that little island of Elba into a little utopia. He revised the education system, the governing system. He built a military. He built a navy. I don't know how he did this so quickly, but he did. And he also started making use of their resources. Napoleon was really quite an interesting person in history, and he continued to do his revolutionary activity on that island. And then finally in the spring of 1815, he escaped. He had the support of people on that island. He escaped. He landed in Italy. The French forces went down to meet him. Actually, I'm sorry, he landed on the coast of France. And so that's why the French forces came down to meet him. And he basically said, okay, arrest your emperor. And instead, they bowed down and they swore allegiance to this returned emperor from exile. And they started marching to Paris. And on March 20th, Napoleon arrived again in Paris as a hero. Remember, the French, they didn't like losing that war, even though new leaders had come to power, and the king, who was Louis XVIII, He was now supposed to be back on the throne, but he had to go into exile because Napoleon was back. Meanwhile, the Congress of Vienna is still having their discussions about how to create the new Europe. And so already in September 1814, they were meeting in Austria, in Vienna, trying to come up with ways to balance power in Europe to keep someone like Napoleon from creating chaos. And so the Napoleon led armies out and started recruiting people again to the army, and they loved him, so they went to battle. But this would be his last stand, and it took place in Belgium, in the city of Waterloo, or at the battlefield near Waterloo. And the Duke of Wellington gets the credit for defeating Napoleon. At that point, you'd think, okay, everyone would have learned their lesson and Napoleon would be executed. Nope. Again, you have more power over a threat if you can isolate it and make it irrelevant, and that's what they did. They sent him to St. Helena, which is a tiny island far, far from everything off the coast of Africa. And so St. Helena was where Napoleon ended up, and he died very much alone. And so Wellington got the credit, and he ended up representing Britain at the Congress of Vienna. So you had Metternich, the chairperson. You had Wellington. You also had Talleyrand, who was a diplomat from France, one of those nobles, well-educated people, not royalty, but someone who was an expert in negotiations. And so Talleyrand, he had actually helped to negotiate the Treaty of Paris in 1814, which was the end of the Napoleonic Wars until Napoleon came back to power. We call this time when Napoleon returned to the defeat at Waterloo, we call that Napoleon's 100 days. So for 100 days, it looked as if Napoleon could restore the glory that he had had, but he was defeated. Now, the Congress of Vienna represents the establishment of a period of peace. That needs to be clarified. There were many wars during the 1800s. We need to remember the revolutions that took place in 1848 and even earlier in 1830. There were constant uprisings for succession, for who got the throne in which country. And it's very important to know that there were families of rulers, and they were closely related. We will talk about that. But two groups of leaders that you need to know are the Habsburgs, which are mainly German kings and queens, and also the Bourbons, who were mainly French kings and queens. Mixed in there, you have the House of Hanover. The House of Hanover is German, but it's also British, and it's also Russian in a sense. And that will show you how complicated and tangled these relationships were among royalty in Europe. So these political players came together, and they were able to produce some results. They were able to bring peace to Europe, more or less, and to keep these major powers from fighting one another. So after 1815, you have the establishment of one of the first major alliances in history. And the Congress of Vienna was one of the first times that countries came together peacefully to try to keep the peace. Usually before that, they had just simply sent an ambassador from one capital to another capital, back and forth. There wasn't a lot of organization to it, and as a result, you had miscommunications and you had wars. So this Congress represented the beginning of new alliances that could keep the balance of power. And That's something you'll hear me talk about quite a bit. The Holy Alliance came out of the Congress of Vienna, and it was the brainchild of Tsar Alexander I. Now, you've heard about Tsar Alexanders. We talked about Alexander II, Alexander III, Nicholas I, Nicholas II. We've talked about all those czars. This is Tsar Alexander I, who is at the beginning of all those. And he was the one who came up with this idea at the beginning of the 1800s that an alliance of religious leaders, religious kings, they should come together and establish order. It sounds very beautiful, right? Usually it was because of their own selfish desire for power as well. So the four main countries you need to know involved in the Holy Alliance were Poland and Russia, and basically Russia would eventually control Poland. So Poland is like Russia's puppet. Poland, Russia, Austria, and Prussia. And Austria and Prussia are very close together. So Poland and Russia, Austria and Prussia, they're pretty close together, and there's a lot of Roman Catholicism within those countries still. Remember, after the Reformation, there was a 30 years war that divided Europe between Protestants, mainly in the north, and Catholics, mainly in the south, and also then into the east. And so the Russian Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church at this time were actually in an alliance. That's pretty unusual in history. Usually the Orthodox Church in the east and the Catholic Church in the west, they were fighting each other, and a lot of bad things were done. So the last one on that list is the one that we really need to emphasize, Prussia. Prussia is a tiny part of what is present-day Germany. It's the northeast part, and it's the part where Berlin, the capital of Germany, is today. So Prussia was basically the coming together of a group of peoples, and they had a long history going back to the Crusades, where they were basically knights fighting to establish Christianity as they saw Christianity. And so that leads us to how Prussia will become a world power. Again, we're going to take a step back and talk about Prussia and Germany, and we have to go back to the Middle Ages. We have to go all the way back to the time about the 800s. In fact, in the year 800, a man named Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope as the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, this is 300 years after Rome fell. And so this is actually the Empire of the Franks. And Charlemagne was the king of the Franks, which was the kingdom mainly of France and Germany, what we think of as France and Germany today. And it did unite much of Europe. And it was very powerful. And this can be referred to as the First Reich. Reich in German means kingdom. So this is the first kingdom. Now, later on in the 1300s, you have an extension of the power of this Holy Roman Empire by the going out of German knights. They're called Teutonic knights, and they went to fight against any invaders, any Eastern invaders, basically people who had a different kind of Christianity or even Mongols. And so the Teutonic Knights were able to establish colonies. They're basically German or Holy Roman Empire colonies in the East. And I did that again, in the East. Sorry if I go the wrong way. And so these knights were known for their militarism, their great military prowess, their abilities. And as a result, that area, which became Prussia, that had a reputation for being a very strong military people and power. And after the Congress of Vienna, Prussia was actually given some land, and so was Russia. Russia was given some land, and Poland was given some land, and so France lost much of what they had conquered during the time of Napoleon, and that was the end of the Congress of Vienna. But Prussia acquired an area called the Ruhr Valley. Remember that? It's in German, it's called the Ruhrgebiet, and it's an area of coal mining and industry. And this is the period where the Industrial Revolution was getting going all over Europe. It had started in about 1750 in England, and then it had spread from England into Germany and even into Russia a little bit. But mainly Prussia was taking advantage of getting this new territory, the Ruhr Valley. And so they became an industrial power and were building railroads and manufacturing weapons. These are things that would be very important for later history in the 20th century. Now, let's just try and come up with a way to distinguish between Russia and Prussia. Remember that Russia is further east and is massive, and Prussia is just a tiny area. Prussia is between France and Russia, or Paris and Russia, so that's one way to remember it. Prussia is between Paris and Russia. Russia. Okay. And at this time, as Prussia is rising, you have Austria declining in influence. They had taken over much of what we call Italy today, the northern part of Italy and Venice and places like that. And so what was happening is Austria was declining in power and Prussia was increasing in power. And that will be very important because eventually Austria would join together with the group of people called Hungary, and they would be a two-king kingdom with a king in Hungary and a king in Austria, and that would become Austria-Hungary. So the Congress of Vienna was the beginning of what we'll call pan-national, or I should say pan-continental leagues, where you have many countries coming together. Pan means all, and so a pan-Europe league would be this Congress of Vienna. And the idea was to keep order and to maintain the balance of power among the powers in Europe, between France and France and Russia and England and Prussia and Poland as well, and Austria. So the group that maintained an alliance was called the Concert of Europe. So the Concert of Europe was the alliance that continued all the way really until World War I. And that was a forerunner of later what would be called the League of Nations, where you had a group of nations all over the world who met together to keep order and to keep wars from happening. This is what came out of World War I. And then eventually after World War II, we established the United Nations, which includes more than 150 nations around the world. Another way to look at this Congress of Vienna is it was the beginning of shaping a European identity and trying to overcome the religious differences and the language differences and the political differences, liberal and conservative, in order to create some kind of union similar to what the United States was able to create. So the United States had been a successful model, except that they had a civil war halfway through the 1800s. And today we have what's called the European Union, which is truly an amazing thing when you consider all of the wars that were fought among the different countries of Europe in history. So I hope this helps you understand how things were developing over the 1800s, how Prussia rose up as a result of the Congress of Vienna and because of a nationalism that was bringing the country together. And I hope it helps you understand how delicate the balance of power was. If one government was overthrown, as France's was, that could change everything if a person like Napoleon rose to power and wanted to invade everybody else. People do many things because of their ideals, because they want a certain kind of government. They will sometimes even use force to try to make that happen. And so that's the story of Napoleon. It's also the story of the United States in the 21st century. Thanks for watching.